how do you fit this into this? Well, we had to change this into this. No, not that. This. Come on, I'll tell you all about it.
Let's go, Mr. Driver.
Oh great, another racing game. That's honestly the first thing that went through my mind when I was told what I'd be working on next at Ocean Software. Not excitement, not, wow, I get to convert a legendary arcade hit. No, I'd spent weeks drawing graphics for WEC Le Mans, and I assumed this was just more of the same. Checkered flags, another lap circuit, more sprite scaling obviously. I hadn't had much chance to get to the arcades around that time, so I genuinely lost touch with what was out there. I had no idea what Chase HQ was or how special it was. I had a lot to learn. What programmer John O'Brien and I ended up building was a ZX Spectrum conversion of a Taito arcade monster on an 8-bit machine with no hardware sprites, no hardware scaling, and no real colour depth. Yet, by the time we were finished, critics were calling it the single best arcade conversion the Spectrum had ever seen, which was crazy. If you were to ask me which game I enjoyed making the most during my years at Ocean Software, it wouldn't necessarily be Batman the movie, it definitely wouldn't be Robocop 3, it wouldn't even be Jurassic Park, it would be Chase HQ. In early 1989, Taito's original cabinet was the undisputed king of the arcades. It ran on Taito's Z system, a dual 68,000 monster arcade board that pushed hardware sprite scaling, custom audio, sampled speech, and a vibrant array of colours. The game also had a weird sexual undercurrent which wasn't lost on us 20-somethings. Anyway, that's enough of that filth. When Ocean Software picked up the home conversion rights, John O'Brien and I were called into Gary Bracey's office where our new project was revealed and told we had to get it all working on a ZX Spectrum and an Amstrad. That was quite a tall order. When I first joined Ocean, I never imagined I'd end up working on one of the most celebrated racing games ever released for the Spectrum. In fact, Ocean hadn't even been my dream employer. They'd released games like Knight Rider and Street Hawk, which weren't exactly setting the world on fire, and Ocean almost felt like my last throw of the dice. Little did I know that Gary Bracey had just begun transforming the company into the home for blockbuster arcade conversions and movie licenses, and suddenly I found myself right in the middle of it. There were no producers back then, no design team, and no master plan. It was just me and John, who had only started at the company a few weeks earlier, and there was no way to rip the graphics from the arcade board. If I wanted the sprites and animations, I had to again physically stand in front of the cabinet with a sketch pad and pencil, sketching every car design, street sign and tree by hand. From those sketches, I moved to an Atari ST using an in-house sprite editor built by John Brandwood. But that tool couldn't rotate or scale your graphics. Every size variation of every car and roadside object at every distance had to be drawn completely from scratch. I'd draw the largest version of the sprite followed by the smallest, and after that I'd draw 3 or 4 frames in between to make it look the objects were disappearing into the horizon. That was fine for regular sized objects, but the buildings and the trees had to be drawn differently. They were made out of 3 parts, a bottom part which would be at ground level and a top part. Between those bookends would be a thin strip which would be repeated a number of times to make the buildings or trees as tall as we wanted. The method worked better for the buildings than the trees. In fact, programmer Paul Hughes described the trees as looking like Wall's Big Feast ice creams. He wasn't wrong. While I was drawing the graphics, I wasn't just measuring myself against the arcade original, I had my own personal bar to clear. I knew our conversion was better than the Spectrum port of Outrun. I just wanted our game to be better than my personal racing favourite Enduro Racer, a game I used to enjoy playing before I got into the industry. Because of the ZX Spectrum's inferior hardware and its habit for creating colour clash, John and I agreed right from the very beginning that the playfield had to be strictly monochrome. The gameplay area was reduced to about 2/3 of the height of the screen, with a character block on either side in order to kill the sprites early before they went off the side of the screen. By rendering the road, the horizon and the cars in black and white, we completely bypassed the attribute clash and only used colour to separate the land from the sky. Stripping out colour freed up massive amounts of processing power, and every single CPU cycle we saved was immediately fed straight back into John's road engine to keep the frame rate as high as possible. Even most of the cars and roadside objects were not masked against the background, which also saved resources. The roots of Chase HQ traced directly back to WEC Le Mans. I'd drawn the graphics for that game while the engine was built by Sentient Software alongside Ocean's Mike Lamb. Once that was completed, John O'Brien began experimenting with the racing engine, squeezing out every last drop of performance. His biggest hurdle was getting the road to split in real time, allowing the player to choose either fork on the road. On the Spectrum, that felt like a pipe dream, but he pulled it off to the complete amazement of the other programmers. By the time Chase HQ kicked off, John was working his absolute magic. Week after week he'd uncover another trick, another clever optimization, constantly redefining what the hardware could do. In those days, working at Ocean meant sitting nearly shoulder to shoulder. I knew that if my artwork fell short, it would undercut John's brilliant technical work, so I pushed every single graphic to be the absolute best I could make it. The whole development, including the Amstrad CPC version, took about 5 to 6 months, and because John coded so efficiently, we landed in a scenario you almost never get in video game development. We finished the core game ahead of schedule with a big chunk of memory sitting there completely unused. And the funniest thing was, I think John genuinely felt a bit guilty about having that spare memory sitting there. So we started thinking of things to add, things nobody asked for. Ocean didn't just tell us what to do. We just decided that we were going to keep polishing this program until it was the best it could possibly be. We kept asking ourselves, what else can we squeeze into 48K? The animated title screen. It all really kicked off with a bit of playful banter in the studio. Programmers Paul Hughes and James Higgins started lightly teasing John to see if they could push him into pulling off something extra special. Up until that point, John hadn't even planned on animating the title letters at all, but the challenge was officially set. I drew the large individual letters of the logo for him to work with, and John watched every combination of bringing the title on screen from the arcade machine, taking notes to try to copy them exactly onto the Spectrum, delivering this fantastic bouncing elastic animation that made the title graphics pop. The heads-up display. We had quite a large area at the top of the screen to fill, and we needed to include information like the player's score, speed, time, distance to target, that sort of thing. So I suggested making it look similar to the top of the arcade cabinet by having the red and blue lights on either side, the relevant information in the middle, and then portraits of the characters that were producing the in-game messages all inside a frame. John liked the idea, so I went ahead and started designing. The main characters were easy, they were based on Riggs and Murtaugh from the Lethal Weapon movies, but Nancy was more difficult. At the time, American football and the Super Bowl had been introduced to the UK on Channel 4, and I was really getting into it. Me and my friends all picked a team that we would follow. Mine was the Cincinnati Bengals because Tigers. I had bought a magazine that was based on the upcoming season and included pictures of the cheerleaders of the Dallas Cowboys, and that's where I found Dorie Braddy, and she became my Nancy. Now, since we couldn't use full screen images of the villains being arrested like in the arcade, I decided to use small portraits for them as well and have them presented at the end of the level. For those, the inspiration I used was a little closer to home. apart from one. I drew Ocean's hardware guy, Steve Lavache, Spectrum and Amstrad artist Martin McDonald, games tester Kane Valentine. Then I threw in Mike Tyson, who was getting up to all sorts of shenanigans in his personal life, and this was even before he bit Evander Holyfield's ear off and all that other stuff that we're not allowed to talk about. Finally, I drew Commodore 64 artist and my arch nemesis Steve Thompson. I call him that because I was always jealous of his use of colour, especially on the Commodore 64. The Game Complete animation. This was a mixture of images I drew based on another magazine that I had bought that contained an article about the upcoming movie Lethal Weapon 2. I also included an animation of two people shaking hands and a couple of generic pictures I drew to fill out the space. I'd also created an end-of-level animation of one of the characters getting out of the car with their gun drawn and walking towards the enemy car, but at that point we didn't have enough room to include it, so it just got deleted. Near the end of the project, Jonathan Dunn came in for the audio. For the 128K model, we managed to squeeze in digitised speech, as well as the amazing tunes and sound effects that John created and amazed many of the players on the final product. When Chase HQ hit the stores on Christmas 1989, the reception caught me completely off guard. Crash Magazine handed it a 95%, Computer and Video Games called it the best ever Spectrum arcade conversion, and it won Best Coin-Op Conversion at the Golden Joystick Awards. By the way, we were told that we weren't allowed to go to the awards because we were too busy and had too much work to do. Reviewers seemed to be more excited about our 8-bit versions for the Spectrum and Amstrad than they were for the 16-bit Amiga and Atari ST versions, which almost never happened back then. But the moment that actually got to me wasn't a magazine score, it was a handwritten letter. We received a letter sent to the office from someone who had spent their own money on the game, taking the time to write to us and simply thank us for doing such a good job. Whoever you were, wherever you are now, it was greatly appreciated. Because Chase HQ was such a massive success, Ocean immediately moved myself and John onto Batman the Movie, a huge film license. We took the core mechanics of the 3D road engine, scaled everything up and made it more colourful for 16-bit powerhouses like the Amiga and Atari ST, and built Batmobile and Batwing levels that would become one of the biggest selling UK games of the decade. In the end, Chase HQ on the Spectrum wasn't made by a huge studio with a massive budget. It was just two of us, me drawing frame by frame on a sketch pad because the technology to do it any other way didn't exist, sitting alongside John, who was optimising the engine and stretching the capabilities of the ZX Spectrum every day. Every road sign, every tree, every tunnel, every frame of animation, every single byte mattered. We didn't have powerful tools or unlimited RAM. What we had was a bit of stubborn pride and a refusal to accept the limits of the machine. I guess that's why more than 30 years later people still bring it up. It proved what was possible when developers refused to accept what was impossible. So next time, the Amstrad and other versions. Yes, including that one.
Your time's up, but we think you've got a future, kid.